Hello everyone, Alan Sens here, and welcome to this segment on the effects of nuclear weapons. In this segment, we are going to look at the effects of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and by extension, the effects of all nuclear explosions generally. I'm afraid this is not going to be the most happiest subject matter, but let's get started anyway. So, by the time we're finished, you should be able to describe the major effects of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and, by extension, the major effects of nuclear weapons generally. So we're going to focus on the two nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in this segment. Now, one of my philosophies behind this video is to move us away from the very common approach to this subject matter, which is to say, to look at it from the point of view of those who were dropping the bomb. So here's a good example. When we read about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, we often read about them from the perspective of the droppers of the bomb. This quote is sort of typical of that general approach, that general perspective. It's a quote from Colonel Paul Tibbets, who was the commander of the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, that dropped the first nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. So it's very much from his experience, and that's not to diminish the experience, it's simply from the perspective of the person who dropped the bomb. Similarly, when we see images or old video clips of the explosions, Hiroshima here on your left and Nagasaki here on your right, the pictures tend to be taken from the perspective, again, of those who dropped the bomb, so from a distance. What I would like to do is change that up just a little bit and try and look more at the effects of bombs from the perspective of those on the ground. This photograph, quite a remarkable one, I think, was taken from the ground about 7 kilometers northeast of the hypocenter of the Hiroshima explosion. So this is actually literally looking up. This photograph is taken looking up into the underside of the mushroom cloud. You can see the foliage and vegetation there in the foreground. And this is the perspective I would like to try to take us through in this video. Okay, so the first impact or effect of nuclear explosions is the initial radiation that we get from these explosions. These are caused by instantaneous penetrating radiation caused by nuclear fission or fusion. All of these effects occur pretty much within the first minute of any nuclear explosion, and most of them actually occur within the first second or so. So this is primarily things like gamma rays and X-rays and so on. The second effect of nuclear explosions is heat, or, if you prefer, thermal radiation. The surface fireball of the nuclear explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all nuclear explosions, is extremely hot. The temperatures can exceed those on the surface of the sun. So for Hiroshima, it's believed that the temperatures of the hypocenter reached 2,982 degrees centigrade. Temperatures at the hypocenter of the Nagasaki explosion are estimated to have reached 3,900 degrees centigrade. That heat is part of the whole narrative of the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. This testimony from a junior college student is typical. This sudden, intense, burning, searing heat. That heat also, of course, created massive burns, horrific burns on people. And this testimony from a grocer at Hiroshima is very typical in describing the burn effects and the physical impact of that heat on the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. next effect of nuclear weapons is blast. The Hiroshima bomb blast wave moved at about 3,200 meters per second, out to a distance of several hundred meters, and then it slowed down to about the speed of sound, roughly 342 meters per second. The Nagasaki bomb blast generated winds estimated at over 1,000 kilometers per hour. What's interesting as well about the blast effect coming from nuclear explosions, which is of course the Earth's atmosphere being displaced, right, by the explosion, is that there's also a back blast. Once the explosive energy is released, a vacuum, of course, is created at the center of the explosion, and the atmosphere then rushes back in to fill that vacuum, and so you get this double blast effect. You get the blast outward and another one coming back in. This graphic illustrates the blast ranges of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Now, this particular graphic is a combination of both bombs. So what they've done here is they've taken the Hiroshima bomb, the Nagasaki bomb, looked at the blast effects, and combined them into one graphic. But you can see here then that it's all in kilometers or miles, and it gives us some indication then of the effect of the blast out to a certain distance from the hypocenter. So, for example, out for about 1.6 kilometers from the hypocenter, you have complete destruction. Severe damage 2 kilometers out, moderate damage 3.2 kilometers out, and 5 out to 5.6 kilometers out, you have light damage. So again, very, very powerful blast effect. And what's remarkable, of course, is that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were extremely small by contemporary standards. And so when we look at some of the larger nuclear weapons in the arsenals of today, those blast impacts, those blast radii are going to be dramatically greater. The effects of the blast, again, are a common component in the testimony of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. This one, from a 4th grade boy, is again reasonably typical. He was blown off his feet by the blast. And as the blast cleared, he could see the destructive impact of that blast wave. For the visual aspects of the impact of the blast wave, we can see these before and after photographs. Hiroshima before the blast on your left and after on your right. And similarly for Nagasaki, on the top before the blast and on the bottom afterward. So the blast basically just swept the structures of the city clear, except for those buildings that may have been built of stone or concrete. Another effect, the next effect of nuclear weapons, is the residual radiation, or as it's commonly called, fallout. This is the residual radioactive material that's pushed into the atmosphere by the nuclear blast, and all the debris and dust and so on that is kicked up by the explosion is then irradiated. And the fallout is the return to Earth of all these irradiated particles, ash and debris, dust, and so on. That fallout can be devastating to humans and to flora and fauna. And once again, from the perspective of those on the ground, this is Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, and he was one of the few doctors who survived the explosion and treated patients as they came in from the Hiroshima bomb. And his testimony provides us with many of the classic symptoms of radiation poisoning from fallout. Many of them die initially. Others seem to be on the road to recovery, but then organ failure sets in from the longer-term effects of radiation poisoning. So over the next few days, the death rate increases again dramatically. I think the final effect is the death and destruction dynamic of nuclear weapons. Of course, all types of weapons cause death and destruction, sometimes on an enormous scale. But again, the impact of the nuclear weapon has this quality to it because it's one bomb and the effect comes in sort of this instant or within a very short time frame. At Hiroshima, the total deaths are estimated at between 90,000 to 140,000 people. And if we extend that out to deaths from extended radiation illness over a 5-year period, the death toll is estimated at 200,000 people. If we look at Nagasaki, the casualty estimates range between 40,000 to 75,000, with total deaths by the end of 1945 reaching approximately 80,000 people. There's another angle here I'd like to explore with you a little bit. One of the aspects that's quite common to the perspectives of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the sense of utter and complete devastation. Here's the testimony of a history professor, which is, again, not atypical. And his testimony speaks to this sense of just loss, of a complete absence of the effective elimination or absence of these cities after the explosion. And Hannah Arendt picked up on this in a way that I think is very interesting and very thought-provoking. She argues that it's not merely the initial radiation, the heat, the blast, the residual fallout that's part of the effects of nuclear weapons. That part of the effects of nuclear weapons is actually the destruction, the complete demolishment of community. And so her quote here, I think, is actually really important for us to remember. I mean, in an instant, communities are completely destroyed. The nature of and substance of human interaction, human relations, is wiped out in an instant. I don't think it's surprising then, in light of all of these effects, that a post-war Japanese study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached these two conclusions. Part of the legacy of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings are the attempts of victims to advocate for disarmament, for peace. The hibakusha, as they're sometimes called, are slowly, of course, dying because of the passage of time. And their testimonies are now being captured in a number of different ways. And one of the leading hibakusha has been Sumiteru Taniguchi over the years. And he was a 16-year-old post office carrier in Nagasaki during World War II. And he's basically given permission for pictures that were taken of him after the explosion to be used because he wants to remind people of what it was like. He doesn't want this memory to be lost. And he wants all of us to carry on the work that he and the other hibakusha, among other anti-nuclear weapons activists and anti-war activists, have undertaken. I wanted to end on a little bit of a hopeful note. Today, the city of Hiroshima is a thriving community. The famous memorial building that you can see in the center of this photo montage here, of course, still exists as a reminder of what happened here, but surrounding it is a thriving, modern community. The same could be said for Nagasaki. Again, you could look at this picture and not have any sense of what happened here. So the communities have survived. The communities rebuilt. But of course, the horrible lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the horrific effects of the nuclear explosions. So now you should be able to describe the major effects of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and by extension, you should be able to describe the effects of nuclear weapons generally. Okay, Well, I know that wasn't exactly uplifting or encouraging material, but it's essential, right? I mean, we have to understand that nuclear weapons have this qualitatively different nature to them. Other bombs can explode with tremendous blast effects. There can be other ways of using radiation as a weapon, but this combination of the power, the radioactivity aspects of nuclear weapons, and the sense of the instantaneousness of the destruction they bring gives nuclear weapons a special quality that we have to respect and we have to include in any discussion about them. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you again soon.